Let me make sure it doesn't break. I think we should be live though. So what's up everybody? Welcome to the Stellar Podcast live edition. I think this is episode 25. 25. We've done 25 episodes. We've been doing these live once a month for a couple months now. I'm Kolten. I'm joined as always by Tyler Vanderhoven. We've got a couple things to talk about today that are community related and podcast related. Not a bunch of like ecosystem news per se, but definitely community related. So the first thing is the podcast. This will be the last episode for a little while. We're going on a little break. I know that everybody is just going to miss us terribly, but I'll let Tyler touch on why we're taking a break, and then why we're taking a break now, and kind of what the plan for the podcast is going forward.
Sure. So there's a few reasons. First, when we started the podcast 25 episodes ago, we weren't doing a whole lot of other, SDF wasn't doing a whole lot of other event type activities. So that has obviously changed, both just as the organization itself has grown and because of the pandemic and having to move tons of things online and remote, and now we're all in front of each other. So as more events have come on, it's making sense more and more to take a break from the podcast and focus more on engineering talks and roundtables and community related events. But then also myself, I've got two big projects coming up that I need to focus on. One is the Stellar Community Fund and this SEP proposal that I mentioned, I think it was last week in an engineering talk, that also needs some focus. But particularly the Stellar Community Fund has needed some work, and it's time to give it a bit more attention, really think through the design and implementation, and have someone who's really focused on iterating on it and supporting it and ensuring that it's performing well. So for those reasons, it makes sense right now to put a pause on at least the weekly broadcasts of the Stellar Podcast. We'll still be doing live shows once a month, but week by week, it'll be engineering talks and protocol discussions and roundtables and all the other things. Make sure you're tuned in to stellar.org/events. There's always amazing things popping up on there all the time. So as you need more Stellar related news and events, that'll be the place to get them. So sad news for that, for sure. I think it's the right move. And eventually I think it'll come back in full force. It might take a different form, but 25 seems like a good number to take a pause on, close it out. Season 1.
Yeah, what a round number. That would have been so bad if we just ended it on 24. Could you imagine the catastrophe? That would just be bad. That being said, like there's another ecosystem podcast, Stellar Ecosystem Podcast. Our friends and community members over at Public Node run, I think it's called Stellar Discussions is like the title of the podcast. But you can head over to, I think it's publicnode.org, and find their podcast. I think they're going to continue doing that. If not, you guys better continue doing it so we don't get in trouble. But no, and I shout out to Tyler because he's been shooting those podcasts and editing them all by himself and then releasing those on a weekly basis. There's been a lot of great guests on those. And like you said, we'll be still doing these once a month. I think the plan is to try to get more guests on to the live podcast. People seem to like that. Last time we had Justin on here to talk about the ecosystem team and his role at SDF. So maybe we'll do some more of that. Maybe get some different ecosystem projects and whatnot to come on the podcast and talk about stuff. I think that's it though for the podcast.
Anything we'll just rip that Band-Aid off real quick. And
we'll get that one over with.
Get that one out.
All right, next topic is the Stellar Community Fund. So if you are in the Stellar Community Fund Keybase channel, there's been quite the debate stirred recently about one single change that we're considering. Understandably though, like the SEF is such like an interesting thing because it's been constantly evolving over the course of like 4 rounds. We ran into a lot of headaches. A lot of things have gone right as well. And it's just been interesting to try to solve problems as they come up and bounce ideas off of each other. So we got a bunch of big changes coming up that we didn't mention in that Keybase discussion. So I will let Tyler take it away from here again and kind of discuss what he's been working on. And I've been helping in the background a little bit on where SCF is going, and so he has a lot to share, and I'll just kind of let him brain dump from here.
Yes. So over the past, I'd say ever since I joined SDF, a priority of mine, at least in the back of my mind, was how to improve the SCF. And so the baton was passed from Zach to myself pretty early on, and we've been running that. This will be the second round that I've been tweaking it and trying to improve kind of what we had so far. And it's a good fund, and I think it's worth noting that the Stellar Community Fund is incredibly important. It is incredibly near and dear to my own life. It was my intro into Stellar. It's how I got familiar with the software, got familiar with the team, became aware of even just cryptocurrency. So it's a project that has meant a lot to me, and I really don't think there's any one sort of final arrival point that you kind of would hit and say, now this thing is perfect. I think it's always going to be iterative. It's always going to be growing and changing, just as the ecosystem changes and the mission of SDF matures, and the projects that are building and the point that the ecosystem is at is changing. And as the project matures and the code that has been written and the open source projects that are available, like as all of those things mature and change, necessarily our mechanism for community funding changes. But with that said, the community fund is definitely in a space that's ready for a big change. And so over the past few months, I've been working on a draft and working with the ecosystem team to redesign the Stellar Community Fund. And that recently got approval. We'll be pushing out actual official releases for this at the end of next month. But I think with the pause of the podcast, and because this is a focus of mine over the next few months to really make sure this gets built right, it's worth spending some time talking about it with the community here on the podcast to just kind of get an understanding of where we're going, and then move that discussion into our Stellar.Community Fund Keybase channel, where we can continue to iterate and improve what we have, and at least all be on the same page for where this thing is going. But I think also it's worth, like, we've spent a lot of time thinking about this. Kolten and I have
way too much time,
spent hours and hours trying to figure out how does this fund work for where we're at. Again, not trying to arrive at a perfect solution, but the perfect solution for where we are right now in the process of growing the Stellar community. And so the proposals that we have and the ideas that we have all come from a place of deep thinking and understanding where our own community is at, as well as kind of what we would want in ourselves in a community fund. So none of these things are necessarily set in stone, but they have been well thought through, and they come backed up by logic and back and forth that eventually will flesh out into a more fully featured blog post again later in August.
To pause real quick though, I do want to add, like, Tyler and I are not perfect. These are we make a lot of assumptions, like when it comes to decisions we make, right? So these are the decisions we came to, like he said, after just a lot of back and forth, a lot of disagreement, a lot of agreement, a lot of feedback that we got from one-on-ones with different people from the community, and then a lot of feedback that we've heard over the course of 4 rounds. So, like, a lot of stuff has gone into this, and I don't think anybody here is claiming that it's like the perfect solution, but we do think it's a huge step in the right direction. So just wanted to clarify that before we keep going.
Right. All right. So with that said, we're going to bravely move forward into some of the more specific details on the changes. So the biggest change is that the Stellar Community Fund will be a community fund, and that isn't a word that we take lightly. Every word in Stellar Community Fund is intentional. It's a Stellar Community Fund, so everything should be building around utilizing and implementing Stellar. It's a community fund. This is not a fund that's dictated by SDF. This is a fund that the community participates in how to distribute the lumens that are allocated into this fund. The community decides where those funds go. And it's a fund, right? This isn't a grant. This is a fund where money is allocated to projects, given away for them to do with as they see fit. And so with the Stellar Community Fund, it's still a Stellar Community Fund, but it's being split into 2 separate funds. It is going to be a seed fund and a lab fund. And so the seed fund is a larger fund dedicated towards bigger projects and businesses that are looking to launch on Stellar. These will be profitable businesses. They have some business methodology for how they're going to keep the doors open. Some of those details still need to work out, but the idea that there's going to be a separation in the fund where we've seen some dissonance in this one fund right now. So like, how do we, if I'm a business, does this belong to me? If I'm just kind of building a hackathon project or something quick, is this for me? It makes sense to split those up and to have prize pools, separate prize pools for each of those. So there'll be the seed fund for bigger businesses that are looking to actually launch and maintain or maybe add Stellar to their existing offering. And then there will be a lab fund, which is targeted at more hackathon type projects. So this is going to be lower dollar prize pools. There's going to be more projects involved, and the rules will be much less stringent than the current SCF rules, where your participation, you can participate in every round, you can retry existing projects. Like, some of those rules still have to be worked out as far as the separation between the two funds, but participation will be much easier in the lab fund, and it'll sort of mimic what we have right now in SCF as far as the frequency, but the prize pool will be lower, but it'll still go on about 4 times a year, and the number of winners will probably be around 12, might be 8 to 12, depending again on participation. And then the seed fund will be a much smaller pool. It'll only run about twice a year, is what we're thinking right now, and will be focused on longer term businesses. Go ahead.
I was just going to add that the problem that we're aiming to solve with this is that over the past 4 rounds, the variance in the size, scale, and quality of projects winning is large. So you have maybe like hackathon style projects, which are legitimate in their own right. And then you have businesses, which are also legitimate in their own right, competing for the same exact prize pool. And so, the 4th place in one round might be very different from the 4th place in another round. But and we're hoping by splitting the fund into 2 different categories that we can lessen that tension, because there has been a lot of tension regarding this over the past several rounds. So being able to split this fund up into 2 and make it a lot easier for people to decide where they fit in, and then also making people comfortable with the end results, is sort of the goal of this part of the restructuring.
Yeah. Yep. That's definitely a lot of the focus, I think, if you're trying to boil down the goals with the changes, is getting funds in the right hands, putting money where it belongs, putting the right amount of money where it belongs.
One more pause. This does not affect this round. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah, that's very important.
Yeah, Brian asked in the chat if this affects this round. No, it does not. But I wanted to clear that up for the people listening to the recording.
Panic. Yes. No, this is going to go in effect. So there's going to be, once this round ends, whenever it makes sense for the next round to start, that will be the beginning of the lab fund. But again, a lot of those details will be discussed and made public once we actually have nailed down the specifics.
Yeah.
The other big piece of this, and this kind of is, again, one of those reasons that I think this really works. I guess to back up a little bit, the goal of this, again, to put money in the right hands. So like, keep that in mind as you're evaluating these things. Is it's not just to give money away. It's we need to make sure we're giving it to the right people, and that's hard to do. That's incredibly difficult to do. I don't think it's impossible, and I think by designing the right fund in the right way, you can accomplish that. It's just, there's so many variables in a system like this that you have to play with them and tweak them and start somewhere and then kind of iterate on top of that. And we've been doing that. That's what we've been doing the whole past year, is tweaking different variables. And I think it's time to try something a little bit more dramatic and see how it goes. After that, the next big change. So one of the things that we're facing in Stellar Community Fund is voter fatigue, where there's just a lot of things to vote on, and particularly over the past few months, as there's just so many Stellar related things to keep up with through Stellar events like the podcast and engineering talks and all this different news and things coming out. And then you've got the Stellar Community Fund, where you've got projects to evaluate and vote on. Having 2 rounds of voting is a lot. And it's a lot to ask of the community, particularly if there's a whole lot of projects to filter through to narrow it down to a final 8. And so one of the big changes is there will only be 1 round of final voting, but there will still be 2 rounds of evaluation. The difference is one will be a community vote, the final round that allocates the percentage of the prize pool to the final projects. That will be 1 round of community voting. But before that, there's a filtering round that goes through a panel of SDF and community. Just lost the word. Nomination. So like they'll be nominating. It'll be a panel of judges. There we go.
Yeah,
Yikes.
there you go.
That's
panel.
a hard word. a panel of judges, which contain both SDF and community members, who will go through the projects, evaluate them based on their merit, whichever fund we're talking about, whether that's the lab or the seed fund. And from that, create or come up with a final list of projects which will be in the final community round. And maybe Kolten, you can talk a little bit about the nomination panel. There's still like details to figure out about how you get on or off that panel, but I think a common recurring theme again and again and again and again is there has to be a better way to evaluate projects before we ask the community at large, any community at large, to filter through potentially hundreds of projects.
Yeah, and it was kind of perfect timing because Brian asked again in the chat if we should do sort of committee or panel. The answer is we like to think so. Again, like Tyler said, we haven't worked out perfect details on how that committee or panel is going to be constructed. We do want it to be a bunch of active community members. If you have thoughts on this, we want you to share them because for now we've just been kind of talking between ourselves, thinking about how this looks. But we do think this is the most efficient method going forward as far as vetting projects, particularly for the larger fund, the seed fund. Mm-hmm. So the idea there is, like Tyler said, to limit voter fatigue, because right now we do acknowledge that it's super exhausting to have to go through all of the, like have the whole community go through all of the projects twice to make decisions on how the final funding should be allocated. So we're hoping to lessen that burden and make the final round the most effective round of voting possible. And we think the best way to do that is through the committee or panel, filtering out projects, passing them on to the community, and then letting the community make effective decisions about how funds should be distributed there. And there was one more question that was asked in the chat, and it said, but there's a Stellar Enterprise Fund, Use Case Investment Fund. Doesn't that cover seed funding? Yes, it can, but it's also very different in structure from the community fund. So the community fund is up for community vote. A business who can qualify for the community fund might be very different from a business that might qualify for a grant from SDF. I'm not part of those teams, so I can't go into a bunch of the details. I'm just not too familiar with them. We can only think about the ways that we can help the ecosystem. So all I know is that the process will be very different, and this will be more suitable for startups who are maybe just getting their feet wet or maybe don't have the means necessary to get like a full-on grant from SDF or something like that. That's the best way I can kind of explain the difference. But anyway, skipping past that, going to the panel, we think that's the best method going forward. And then somebody asked, I'm trying to keep up with the questions and talk at the same time. Somebody asked, what's the split between the seed and community fund? Do we have exact numbers?
We have numbers in our head. Okay. It'll be smaller. So like there are 3 million times 4, so there's 12 million lumens to figure out how to split that every year. So that's the number that we're playing with between the seed fund and the lab fund. So however that shakes out, we're still working exactly on what those numbers are, but it'll probably be a pretty significant difference between the two.
Yeah, I would the best way to think about it is the lab fund will be sort of analogous to like a hackathon type prize pool. It won't be like super life changing for the people who get it or anything like that, right? It's not gonna be some like crazy amount of money, but it's gonna be enough to make you stoked that you worked on that project for whatever amount of time it was. And then the seed fund will be much larger for creating sustainable business and being able to sort of bootstrap finances for those businesses. Is there any? Okay, I think that was all for the questions. So last thing we touched on was committee. So whatever you
nomination panel is really important. That's kind of a new arena for us. We had it back in the Stellar Build Challenge days. This will be quite different operatively than that was, but landing on exactly what that looks like and who the members are and how they get in and out and What this percentage split is between SDF and community still remains to be seen. But the whole point of it being to reduce voter fatigue by ensuring that the projects that make it in front of the final voting panel or the final voting round, community voting round, are quality projects that meet the goals of whichever fund you're talking about, the seed or the lab fund. And it's still, I think we need to emphasize that we cannot in this kind of short circuit the community aspect of it. The community still needs to be involved. It's just which community and how many of the community members are involved in that particular panel.
Yeah, and one thing I'll say about the panel, you did mention that it'll be part SDF, part community. It will be majority community. That's not up for debate or anything like that. Like, it'll be mostly community members. But we do think there's a lot of benefit to having members of SDF in the panel as well, just because they bring a sort of unique insight along with the community's insight.
Yeah, and that's come up again and again and again is, can we just have SDF pick all the projects? And the answer is no, because this is a community fund. But that doesn't mean that we're not also part of the community and can have some say. It's just it's again that percentage share, and still have to work out some of the details there. But I think that having that split will be instrumental in ensuring that, again, the point of getting the right amount of money in the right hands is that happens.
Yep.
So the next piece is, once we get past the nomination panel for a project and we arrive at some final number of projects up for community vote, distribution of the prize pool by vote, we have a new voting mechanism, which I know is very near and dear to Kolten's heart, and he sold me on it, and it's fantastic, and I'm extremely excited about it. And it is called
Quadratic Voting. Yay.
Yay.
Everybody's like, what is that? Okay, so I'll kind of introduce it a little bit. Basically, if you think about the way that the community votes now, it's pretty linear, right? You cast 3 votes for a particular project, and then the prize distribution looks something like this. There's a lot of argument to be made. I don't think it's worth like that. I feel like that could be a whole podcast by itself.
Sure.
But there's like a whole argument to be made that that's not an optimal distribution, right? The variance between the project in first place and the project in third place could be very large, and you want your voting mechanism to be able to reflect that. If a project deserves the majority of the funding through the vote, they should be able to accomplish that. And so quadratic voting, effectively the way it works is it allows you to express as much interest as you would like in a particular outcome. So the way that works is you're allocated a particular amount of credits. In the real world, quadratic voting, you would kind of pay for those credits, and the cost per vote would scale quadratically, but we don't want to do that. We want to test quadratic voting out first before we start like doing full-on implementations that, you know, abide by the correct proofs and stuff. So basically you'll be given credits and you'll be able to vote on a particular project. Tyler's put together a demo. We won't be able to show it on video, but I think he can post it in the chat and people can experiment with it and play with it. These votes have no effect on anything in the demo. It's just to play with so you can kind of get a feel for what it's like. But essentially, if you want to vote on a project multiple times, you can, but the cost of that vote scales quadratically. You can also downvote for a particular project that you're not interested in. This creates a super valuable market dynamic between voters and then who you're voting on. So effectively, you can come to the sort of optimal distribution pattern. We aren't completely sold on whether or not it's going to work how we think, right? Like, it's obviously very experimental, but we want to try it out because, again, this restructuring is all about optimizing distribution, which we feel like SCF has not done the best job of over the past 4 rounds. So by introducing quadratic voting, it will allow the community and the voters to express how they want funds to be distributed in the most efficient way, or what we think will be the most efficient way possible. And Tyler, maybe like, since we had a lot of conversation, I tried to summarize it the best I could. I don't know if that's like the best summary, but maybe you can give a summary from all of the conversations we've had on why you think it might, you know, be helpful.
Yeah, so we've talked about this a lot, and I think it is important to preface with there's no guarantees with this. It's more looking at other entities that have used quadratic voting in the past, particularly in the same vein that the SCF would be categorized as. as far as number of voters, number of items that you have to vote on, and the weight or cost per vote. Um, it seems that quadratic voting would make a lot of sense. And so, particularly with the lab fund being a lower dollar vote, there's a little bit more room to experiment with, does it work well, and where might there be some areas for tweaks. But essentially, yeah, the idea is you have credits that you use per vote. I posted a demo link in the chat where everybody can click on that and go kind of play around with it a little bit. But essentially, you're given 100 credits, and then as you vote on projects multiple times, the initial vote for everything would be 1, and then if you vote again on the same project, it would be kind of your second vote. So 2 times 2 is 4, so it would burn 4 credits. So that essentially means you could vote on a single project 10 times, and that would burn all your credits because 10 times 10 is 100. There are some potential issues, I think, though we have to address with gamification and, well, if it's really easy to kind of create an account and then people just vote all their credits on one project, that's definitely a concern. And there's lots of different angles you can approach voter manipulation and how to address it. I want to be careful assuming gamification before we actually start to see how it plays out. But there are a couple of things that you can put into place to mitigate some of those. And one of those would be a flag. So as you start to vote up or down something, if some project seems to be running away with the prize, or it's kind of obvious that there's been some manipulation going on, either somebody's downvoting or upvoting a project, you have the capability to upvote or downvote and then add a flag onto that particular project. So if something seems to be running away, rather than using all of your credits to try and counteract the manipulation, you flag up or down, whichever direction you think the project should be going. And then you add your flag to it to say, hey, I think this project's being downvoted into an oblivion, or somebody bought, a click farm and this is being upvoted way too much. Somebody should look into this. And then you're able to go from that with moderators to look into those potential manipulations and address the vote accordingly. But it's a back and forth, because again, there's the problem with voter manipulation, which we're trying to alleviate through a panel, but then also welcoming in new voters and having the SEF be an on-ramp into the ecosystem, where again, the point of the SEF is to get money into the right hands. And that requires that we have a lot of voters participating, not necessarily on judging whether or not Stellar is implemented, but whether or not the actual business is viable, whether the project is valuable. And yeah, maybe at some level that should be dedicated to active Stellar community members. But I would argue that oftentimes, largely, it's going to be external, that there are people that want this project to exist, that want to use this service that implements Stellar. But Stellar is not in itself a service. It's something that you implement. It's not a tool. It's not a product. It's software that needs to be implemented in other pieces of software or services. And so those are the things we want to see succeed, with Stellar being implemented in those. And so I very strongly feel that for that to succeed, for that to be true, we need to open up voter participation to a wider audience than just, do you have a Stellar account, or have you written a Reddit post, or are you in our Keybase channels? I would love for that to happen, and that would be awesome if it did. But part of getting funding in the right amount of funding in the right hands means that the right projects are succeeding, regardless of whether or not they're blatantly, Stellar advertisers. Are they using Stellar? If they are, like, again, that goes through the panel. The panel makes that decision whether or not they implement Stellar, whether they're doing the right thing, whether they're breaking any rules, etc. And then once they make it into the final voter round, there's a bit more freedom to start to open up the floodgates of voters, if you will, to a much wider audience, which is kind of where we circle back around to the discussions that were happening with our voter registration for how do you log in or create an account to be able to vote, being either key-based proofs or an SMS message. But the quadratic voting, I think, will be a good tool in sort of making something that was two-dimensional, where you weren't able to add what I would call like voter velocity of, I really don't like, or I really do like this particular project, where all you could say is, I like this, this, and this, but you weren't able to say a velocity. And you also weren't able to say, look at this project, I think something's up with it. By adding velocity, you add intensity to where you can express a bit more of your emotions about projects, which I think do start to allocate funds in the right direction in a way that just linear voting it can't do.
Yeah, not only do we want to maximize participation, but we want to maximize like the outcome of an individual vote. Like to take a step back, what this will feel like, or what we hope it'll feel like whenever you begin voting for a particular project, is that you'll log in, you'll have your credits, and you'll see, let's say, a list of 5 projects, and you might only like 2 of them. That might be it. And so you could spend all of your credits on those 2 projects, or you might only like 1 of them, and you can spend all of your credits on 1 project and be done. Or you might really like 1 and really hate 1. You could spend most of your credits liking 1 and then spend the rest of them disliking 1. And so you can create this really interesting voting mechanism where you maximize the outcome of each individual's votes because they're allowed to express their preference. And we think, and the assumption is, that this will help optimize distribution, because if each person sort of maximizes the potential behind their vote, then we'll maximize the efficiency of the distribution. So there's a lot of words. I'm mixing my words up.
That's the idea. And whether or not quadratic voting is the best way to do that still remains to be seen. There's so many different ways to vote on things. Yeah. It's just about finding the one that works best for what our project actually is, and the number of entries you have to vote on, the nature of liking and disliking things, the amount of money that might be at stake. There's all the ease at which something can be manipulated. There's just so many factors that come into play in trying to find the best mechanism for picking a voting preference. So it's really just try something. It's put something out there that feels right, that might work, and then iterating on that as time goes on. And that iteration now will cost less, but still be the same effectiveness, because we have the ability to experiment in the lab fund. Whereas the seed fund, even though we will still use quadratic voting, the process by which something actually makes it to the final community vote is much more stringent. And also it will be a very limited number of final entries, to where there's some level of assurance that these projects are legitimate and viable and aren't in a position to game the system. And it would be much easier to find manipulation because there's just not many players.
Yeah. And I mean, the worst case scenario is that we can like always fall back on the original voting mechanism. Right. And it's not that one's terrible or anything like that. We just don't think it's optimal, and we would love to optimize things where we can. So we're just going to continue doing that. Somebody complimented QV, so great. I wish I had came up with it. We didn't come up with it. It's part of a much larger movement called Radical Markets by Glenn Weil. They're also experimenting with it in the Ethereum ecosystem through quadratic funding and a couple of other mechanisms. So if you want to research that and go down the rabbit hole like we if you want to go down the rabbit hole, go ahead. You'll get lost like we did, but it's really fascinating.
It's a wonderful place to get lost, though. Yeah, it's figuring out how to give money away. You wouldn't think it would be this difficult, but it's hard to do well, and in no way, shape, or form have we figured it out. But we're taking a stab at taking a more serious look at it and really thinking through with a bit more science and research what could work better to maximize the fund that we have and ensuring we're putting the right amount of money in the right hands.
Yeah, and I mean the overarching theme of this podcast was just kind of put it all out there. Like we've been getting into the weeds with this stuff for I don't even know how long. Like it's been a long time that we started kind of working on the original groundwork for this sort of new restructuring. So it's kind of relieving to put it out there, and of course we want to do that in order to get feedback from the community, because ultimately this is a fund for you guys. We want to make sure that what we're saying kind of makes sense, that the restructuring kind of makes sense, that everything makes sense, and if it doesn't, we want to hear about it. That way we can get it fixed. And I think it's also worth touching on, there's a round going on right now still, so don't let all the shiny new things distract from the round that's going on. Round 5 is going on. I think nominations open Monday?
Open up. Yep. So
Monday,
Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern
Sunday at 8
time.
p.m.
Midnight Monday, UTC. Nominations will open. They'll be open for a week, which will pick the final 8 projects. out of our, I think, 21. And then from that, we have a week break, and then we have the final round of voting.
Yep.
And there's some fantastic projects in this round.
Yeah.
If nothing else, the change that we made last time has started to really produce some fantastic entries, and it's really encouraging to see those changes start to work and the excitement around SCF continue to grow. I just want to make sure we're fostering that and continuing to build the best fund for these types of projects, and ultimately the goals that that our community deserves out of this community fund.
Yeah, agree. And so I think the plan after this round is to take a pause for a bit, right? After round 5.
Yeah, so this round ends August 10th. I think, yes. It ends August 10th. And then we'll take a break for, I mean, it won't be a super long break, but it'll be long enough for us to get a new website up, both a marketing site, and to get a very good blog post written up and posted describing all of these changes in further detail, to get the new voting websites up so that we're able to collect votes, to get a new system for submissions, and to organize the panel of judges. There's lots of things that need to get worked out and put into place. That'll all be going on between now and whenever we release it. But things are well underway. Obviously, we've put thought into this. We're putting it out there to start receiving some feedback and discussion, and hopefully to come out with a fund that's better than ever.
Boom. Is there
Boom.
I felt like we went for a long time, but we really didn't. I think we just covered a lot of ground in a short time. That being said, is there anything else you wanted to add before we just kind of wrap it up?
I don't think so. I'm excited. Again, if you have thoughts and want to join the discussion, particularly around the community fund, just go to Keybase, and there's a team called stellar.communityfund that you can join and discuss all things community fund. Make sure you go to Galactic Talk and look up the SCF tag there underneath proposals, so you can poke around at all of the round 5 proposals. And then next week we'll have our nominations for that, so keep an eye out for when those open up. Other than that, it's been a fantastic 25 episodes, and we will see you in the next live show.
Yeah, which should be a month from today-ish. You know, these kind of, the schedules of these kind of ebb and flow a bit, but it should be within the next month. We're going to try to get a guest on. I was about to say his name, but I'm not going to do it. It's not anybody super crazy or anything, but we're going to make sure he gets on here because he needs to get on here. And if he's listening, he might know who I'm talking about. But anyways, yeah, thanks for listening. If you want to re-listen to some of the other episodes we've done, you can just go through the YouTube, or you can go to podcast.stellar.org. Our Twitter handles are on the video itself, so if you want to get mad at us or talk to us about anything, go right ahead. Just kidding. And then what else? If you want to follow Stellar News, twitter.com/stellar.org. We've been tweeting a lot of stuff there, like every day. So if you're behind on any Stellar News, follow that and you'll no longer be behind. Yeah, but other than that, we'll see everybody in Keybase, and we'll see you all, I guess, at the next live show. Thanks for watching.
All right, super duper. See you guys.